no longer under the control of the Republic of Viet Nam. By the all access routes from Saigon to Bon Ma Thuot had been cut off. The Liberation Army gained complete control of Dak Lak, even Pleiku and Khan, which were favored by the wealthy general, and had troops stationed there, could not hold their ground. He did not want to see his army stand firm against the communist forces. But all that was reported was scenes of chaotic fleeing. Saigon soldiers were now more concerned about their families than about the so-called survival of the country. In that situation, Thieu should have focused on boosting the morale of the army so that they would return to hold onto the Central Highlands at all costs. But he did the opposite. On May 14, 1975, while the Liberation Army was still wreaking havoc in the Central Highlands, Thieu convened an emergency meeting in Cam Ranh. Those in attendance included Plam Van Phu, Sao Van Vien, Tran Thien Kiem, and several other Saigon officials. The meeting began with the general's incredibly pessimistic war report. Bon Ma Thuot was completely lost. Lu was under artillery pressure, and all connecting lines had been blocked by communist forces. After listening intently, Shao asked, "Can we get the magic shop back?" He seems to have recognized the strategic value of the city. But the opportunity to start over is gone. T. Haeng gave an evasive answer, then turned to the general and asked, "How many troops do we have left to deploy to Military Region 2? The general could only acknowledge the truth. The last remaining forces had already been dispatched. Saigon now has no reserve troops left. Thieu already knew this information. The course at Cam Dan was just a pretext for him to make his decision. A decision that would completely change the destiny of the Republic of Viet Nam. All Saigon troops in the Central Highlands will be withdrawn to defend more strategically important positions. In Thieu's calculations, he could not afford to lose military regions 3 and 4, the coastal areas, the mainland, and most importantly, Saigon and the Mekong Delta. These are all wealthy, densely populated, and resource-rich regions. So focusing efforts on protecting them is essential, as if to reassure the cabinet. He said this was a tactical retreat to preserve forces and retake the magic trade. As for Military Region 1, having been cut off from Military Regions 3 and 4, Thieu believed it was best to hold on to whatever parts of it he could. Strange. President Thieu's policy took a 180 from a firm refusal to compromise territorially with the communists to a defensive policy based on merit. Those attending the meeting that day simply sat quietly and listened to President Thieu's instructions, partly because they were complacent, and partly because they thought Thieu knew what he was doing. Deep down, Thieu understood that this was an unavoidable choice because the Saigon army had become too weak while the liberation forces were advancing like a whirlwind. But he relentlessly attacked America. Thieu argues that the U.S. cutting aid was the main reason for the severe decline in the Republic of Vietnam's combat and territorial defense capabilities. In 1974, Saigon received $700 million in aid from Washington, a record low since the war began. There was no immediate resistance. The Republic of Vietnam needed over $1.5 billion annually just to maintain its territory. If the aid were cut to $700 million, or half, the South Vietnamese army would only be able to hold half of the territory. Indeed, he managed to retain exactly half of the territory by the end of Military Regions 1 were completely under the control of the Liberation Army. Before Thieu's eyes was a bleaker picture than ever before, and perhaps he will soon have to prepare for the final battle. Music. The defeat in the Central Highlands presented Thieu with a fragmented Republic of Vietnam having lost military regions 1 and 2, and losing all of his most elite corps. This had a severe impact on the morale of the Saigon army and the public's trust in its armed forces. That gloomy atmosphere hung over the entire cabinet of Thieu. It got to the point where Minister of the Interior Bu Vian had to shake his head and tell him that only God could save the situation now, as loyalty to a leader diminishes. Factions begin to emerge. Many opposition political parties criticize Thieu, blaming him for the humiliating failures in military regions 1 and 2. There were even rumors that Thieu would be forced out in a coup. Unwilling to accept this, President Thieu ordered Prime Minister Kiem to reform the cabin rules. But unfortunately, no one wanted to serve a president with such low prestige. And if they wanted to, they would make outrageous demands. Disappointed, President Thieu demanded that Kiem resign on April 0, 1975, and appointed Nguyen Bacan to the position. At the same time, the U.S. requested that the Republic of Viet Nam prepare for a political solution regarding the Liberation Army. Washington understood that the communists had gained overwhelming dominance, so any military effort by Saigon would be futile. The only viable way out now is to sit down and talk to each other. But Thieu was not the type to enjoy conversation. As long as he remains in the presidency, bloodshed is inevitable. Therefore, if they wanted to talk to Hanoi, they absolutely had to let Thieu go. This was the shared view of both the Americans and the South Vietnamese generals, who had lost to Thieu in the election, harbored a plan to overthrow the government by establishing the National Salvation Committee. In fact, this committee had been established earlier, but it wasn't when the situation became extremely volatile, that its activities gradually got on track. Nguyen Cao Khai was ready to use force to oust Thieu from the presidency with the ultimate goal of fighting against communism. However, all of their calculations were no match for the shrewd minds of Washington. Grand Martin, in Greater Saigon, turned him into a tool for the White House to achieve its ambitions in South Viet Nam. That was a death sentence for the Republic of Viet Nam. One morning, Attorney Martin and intelligence officer Charles Times visited Kai's home to inquire about his health. During this visit, the two American officials questioned Mr. Kai about his plans to form a new government through a coup against Nguyen Van Thieu. Mr. Kai cautiously replied, "If I were to replace Thieu, would let him go. Judging Thieu is the people's responsibility, not my concern." Modern and Des continued to inquire to see how determined K was to fight. After a while, the two men stood up and left, uttering vague words of support for General K. "Please give me a few days, and I'll see how I can arrange things." Their success that day was preventing Kai's plan to stage a coup by force, because Kai thought that the U.S. had given the green light to his warlike government. But who would have thought that the American arrangement would be so two-faced? After his conversation with K, Morin went to the Independence Palace to meet Thieu on April 20, 1975. Without beating around the bush, he got straight to the point. To stop the Viet Cong advance, a political solution is needed. Talks with Hanoi are necessary. Modern views introductions as an obstacle in negotiation. If I am an obstacle, then I resign. Could the U. Congress change its stance and continue providing aid to the South? Marin responded with only one word, which could be considered neither here nor there. And so, the very next day, Thieu resigned. He declared from Saigon that he would fight alongside his fellow soldiers. But the way he did it was by fleeing overseas with 16 tons of gold. The burning has been completed. Following proper procedure, Vice President Tran Van Huang assumed office. Year-old man, afflicted with hepatitis and barely able to see, was unable to regain his fighting spirit. Of course, his appointment was merely a formality because the U.S. later influenced the farmers to cede the position to Dong Van Min. So, Washington's personnel arrangements have been a resounding success. In return, Nguyen Sao Kai received a devastating blow. After his meeting with Martin, Kai was convinced that after Thieu resigned, the U.S. would contact him to include him in the new government. But all the telephone lines were silent. It was only when he called general teams directly that he realized the U.S. only wanted to use him as a shield. As if clinging to a last glimmer of hope, Nguyen Sao Kai drove straight to the presidential palace, asking permission from President Huang to command the army that was fighting against the communists. Mr. Huang hesitated. He wanted to wait a few days to assess the situation before handing over the authority. Just hearing that was enough for Luo Q to understand that he no longer had any chance to fight. Nguyen Sao Kai subsequently fled South Vietnam on an American ship. Thus, Washington simultaneously ousted both a weak-willed president and a defiant communist general to install an individual willing to negotiate with the North. At this point, we probably all understand what America's true intentions are. On the day Min took office, the Liberation Army attacked Tan Son Nhat Airport with planes, which was often described as just a smokescreen. They understood that Hanoi would not want to talk and would instead invade Saigon. Force. The last lines of defense around Saigon crumbled. And what was bound to happen happened. The 17th parallel has become a thing of the past. All of Vietnam has come together to choose one cause. The Saigon regime officially collapsed, ending U.S. and Vietnamese intervention. The Liberation Army's victory on April 30th was the inevitable result of many factors, ranging from the Vietnamese people's will to fight for national independence and territorial integrity, to the weaknesses of the Saigon government and the manipulation by Washington's political establishment. Many Vietnamese people living abroad still harbor thoughts of revenge whenever this historical day is mentioned. Our brothers on the other side have succeeded, so now we must accept that as history, and the country has been unified. And then they turn around and say they're still talking about restoring the nation. Restoring the Vietnamese nation didn't mean it was lost to the West or China. So why talk about restoring the nation? Hatred is not something that will forever remain in the blood of the Vietnamese people. Anyone who shares the desire to contribute to the prosperity and stability of the country can return. Ha music.